So today we're lucky to have Hilde Hoogenboom from Arizona State University speaking to us on sentimental realism or literature in Russia. And Hilde's собеседник will be John Randolph of University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We're all looking forward to the talk, the response, and the discussion. So please, Hilda.
So good morning, and my thanks to the 19V team for a year of great talks. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I work on women writers, and for the past 20 years, I've been working on how to integrate them into Russian literary history, and at the same time, significantly changed thinking about that 19th century Russian literary history. It's a challenge to integrate women writers because the field is very invested in its classics, its canon, it's resistant. But I think we've discovered this year that it's not only resistant to women, but it's resistant to nearly all other writers in Russian literature. And we have a quantifiable canon, thanks to Greta Matzner-Gore, who looked at 4 leading journals over 10 years. And so you might say that we have a Dostoevsky problem, but let's be honest, even most of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky's works don't qualify for the canon. And I'll be discussing one of those works by Dostoevsky today. So you might be surprised to know how many writers, how many women writers there actually are in Russian literature. And so the Russian Writers 1800 to 1917 7-volume series predicts they'll have about 3,500 writers. And of them, I've calculated about 400 are women. The Bibliographic Dictionary of Women Writers from 1891 has about 1,300 women writers out of about 1,900 women who are involved in all aspects of literary production. And that's about half of the 4,000 women in British literature, which is probably not too shabby. So here you have a slide from the Dutch EU database, Women Writers, on the reception of women. And there are about 500 women in this for Russia, and I've overseen parts of that. And if you have students, researchers who are interested in working on women writers in any part of Europe, this is the database for them. It's a working database. You might also be surprised to know that next year is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Nadezhda Khvoshchinskaia. And over 50 years, she produced a dozen novels, 24 tales, poetry, drama, sketches, essays that were translated into French, as we see here, German, Italian, Swedish, Serbo-Croatian, Czech. She herself did 30 translations from French, German, Italian, and Norwegian. By 1870, she was the 3rd highest paid novelist after Tolstoy and Turgenev. And in 1861, the Dostoevskys invited Khvoshchinskaia to write for their journal. She had just published 2 novels in 1 year, no mean feat, bringing her total for 1850 to collected works. And so Khvoshchinskaia turned Dostoevsky down. She turned down Evgenia Tur at Ruskaya Rich, and she turned down others because she was overcommitted. So where are the narratives for these data? This was my question at ACES in 2015 to the editors of Oxford's History of Russian Literature. And it was rewarded by 1 sentence about Khvoshchinskaia about being the 3rd highest paid novelist in 1870. This line was quoted by Boris Dreyuk in his TLS review, Bagging Monsters. And so I come back to a question Irina Savkina asked in a 1997 review of 22 books on Russian women writers, how to write that history without doubling the canon, without creating a mini canon or an anti-canon, still remains an open question. So how to write about women without making them different or separate, which has been a very tried and true strategy throughout the past half century. So In my book, Noble Sentiments and the Rise of Russian Novels, my chapters pair men and women, Russian and foreign, in new, unusual, interesting ways. Karamzin and Miranda Jean-Lee, Zhukovsky and his cousins, the Yushkova sisters, Anna Zontag and Avdyotya Yelagina, and Maria Fyodorovna, Pushkin and Sophie Katan, Yevgenia Tur, Gonchirov and Turgenev, Khvoshchinskaia and Dostoevsky, and the Tolstoys. And George Sand underlies the second half of this book because she was the central node that connected Europe and Russia, men and women, and readers and writers. And I'm very pleased that among the listeners today is Isabel Nijinsky, who is one of the rare specialists on George Sand in Russia. So I discovered that Russian writers had three things in common: the most international literary market in Europe, sentimentalism, and Russia's unusual noble service culture. So when we look at Russia through literature in Russia rather than Russian literature, we challenge traditional notions of 19th century, not only Russian literature, but European literature. There were many women writers. In Russia, they were usually foreign. Sentimental literature lasts a whole century, and it hybridizes easily with all the genres we know and love in the 19th century. Sentimentalism is not about the expression, but about the restraint of feelings through duties to others, to society, to the greater good. This is the sentimentalism that engaged the 18th century philosophers, the philosophes, the moral sense school. And what about the influence of Russian literature, of European on Russian literature? Well, it shows Russian literature was part of a very big conversation as it adapted what has been called the war of duties to the tensions of service duty in Russian noble culture. So sentimentalism was, and it turns out remains, a big deal. History of emotions today relies heavily on 18th century sentimentalism for its narrative of the democratization of emotions. But perhaps we should really be talking about the democratization of duties to others, to society. The history of today's neoliberalism is deeply rooted in 18th century individual rights and in the treatises on government by John Locke. But that is only half the story. In fact, it's probably less than half the story, because Locke's treatise on moral education was the most influential. We all remember the first really big blockbuster sentimental novel, Pamela, from 1742 by Samuel Richardson. But I don't know if everybody gets to the end where Pamela is discoursing on Locke's treatise on education when she thinks about how to educate her child. And she thinks that Locke isn't quite right. So intellectual historians today are finding a lost history of liberalism, of duty to society, to the common good, and of moral education. So these are some of the big takeaways from my work. Now on to some data on the international literary market. Franco Moretti found Russia imported about 80% of its literature, and I looked through the sources in the bowels of the Columbia Library, and I found about 90% through the 1850s. And so this means that when we talk about Russian literature, we're talking about 10, maybe 20% of the market. And it turns out that Russia is not an exception. Almost all countries in Europe are importing literature. And they're importing, of course, French literature, which is highlighted in red here, but they're also importing German literature, especially in Russia. The Kotzebue was a worldwide phenomenon. Lafontaine you've probably heard of, but you probably haven't heard of Van der Velde and Spies. And they were fellow travelers with Walter Scott, the historical novel, and with Anne Radcliffe and the Gothic novel. In fact, they were posthumously revived in Russia to fill in these genres. So my book has about 30 graphs, charts, 20 devoted to literature, 10 in Russia, 10 European writers in Russia, and the rest about the book market more generally. And so we see here the phenomenon of Kotzebue and the booms around 1802 and 1825 coincide perfectly with Karamzin's complaints and then later Pushkin's complaints. When Karamzin is complaining about Kotzebuetina, it's really, it's hard to overestimate how big Kotzebue's market share is. He's nearly 20% of the market. And sentimental writers were a touchstone throughout Europe. Jeanne Lee was not only the most important French woman writer in Europe, she was the most important French writer. And we see that she was a phenomenon of her lifetime mostly, as was Lafontaine. The individual best-selling sentimental novel was Sophie Catan's 1806 novel, Elisabeth ou les exilés de Sibérie. And these novels, we think of the British as basically exporting and importing very little. All of these works are at the top of the bestseller list. Lafontaine, Kotzebue, Jeanne Lee, they're in the top 5. And so I really think that because I started by looking at Russia's international market, it turned out that I discovered a lot about the markets throughout Europe, that they're much more international than we've ever really thought. So I have a few other charts just to kind of give you a sense of what this literary picture of literature in Russia looks like. And one thing that's important to realize in putting together these charts is that I'm not just looking at the first editions of works. We're looking at market penetration, and so we're looking at all the reissuing that's going on. Every novel is published, in multiple editions, and so this gives you a much better sense of what readers are seeing. And we see that both Dumas and Scott have a resurgence by the end of the century, and that is because of the expansion of the young adult sector of the market. And then finally, all the Dostoevsky scholars might be interested in learning more about Dostoevsky's nemesis, Paul de Kock. And you see that he's not publishing that much, but he's publishing very reliably. So what the Russian market was, however, exceptional in one important way, and that was in its breadth and its depth. And so we can see that here when we compare translations of George Sand in Germany and Russia, and they were the countries that translated her the most and the fastest. And we see that the Russian interest in Sand simply held steady through the end of the century. And now I have a very fun Gephi graph for you, network analysis that also makes that very clear. So how did the Russians compete? How did Turgenev compete, for example? So this is a preliminary graph of his production, and we see that he had a varied approach to keeping his name before his readers, using all different genres and reissues. So Turgenev, however, did what Balzac did, what Dumas did, and what all the Russians did. He adapted sentimentalism and hybridized it with his novels. And Franco Moretti explains this hybrid realism. it's a regular monotonous pattern. All of Europe reading the same books with the same enthusiasm and roughly in the same years, when not months. All of Europe united by a desire not for realism. The mediocre fortune of Stendhal and Balzac leaves no doubts on this point, not for realism, but for what Peter Brooks has called the melodramatic imagination, a rhetoric of stark contrasts that is present a bit everywhere and is perfected by Dumas and Sue and Verdi, who are, well, in Moretti's words, the most popular writers of the age. He's missing quite a few there. So let's look at how Pushkin adapted, Russified, hybridized the sentimental war of duties in The Captain's Daughter. And this is from an article that I published in 2015. And here we see the hero engaging in the usual sentimental comparison of his duties. What should he do? But we also have a heroine. She's the title heroine. And I think we often miss how radical his ending is. And scholars have compared it to Walter Scott's Heart of Midlothian, but I believe that his inspiration came from Catin's Elisabeth, ou les exilés de Sibérie, which is the tale of exiled Polish nobles in Tambov. And the daughter Elizabeth walks across Siberia in order to plead her father's case with the Emperor Alexander I and arrives at his coronation. She falls to her knees, she raises her hands and creates a sentimental tableau to her virtue. And her virtue is her understanding of her duty to her father. And Alexander understands immediately how virtuous she is and grants her request because, of course, her father must also be virtuous to have had such a virtuous daughter. And she has had to choose between her love for a certain Smolov, the son of the governor of Tambov, who happens to be standing in this scene as well. And so it epitomizes the war of duties. You have to choose your duties. You choose your most difficult duty, not the one you would prefer to do. And central to this, central to all European sentimental novels for the most part, is your filial duty. So I was very surprised to read in the London Review of Books, a review of Pavir and Volokhonsky's new translation of Pushkin's prose, in which James Meek uses this article to argue that Catin is responsible for harming Pushkin's prose. So I'm quoting, Catin's stilted, artificial, and relentlessly moralistic medieval martyr story damages Pushkin's writing. The sprightliness drains from the narrative. Colorless female characters perform a tired enactment of pious virtue and are rewarded by a divinely sanctioned sovereign. It's as if at the very moment when women come to the fore, Pushkin finds himself grasping for a style and a point of view he can't find. Well, I don't think any of us recognizes the Pushkin we know and love in this description, and in my view, Pushkin perfectly understood sentimentalism because what he did was transform the European tableau to filial duty to a tableau to service duty. And so he found a way to incorporate women, noble women, into the sentimental narrative. And so this was the challenge that he handed off to the next generation of writers. So the War of Duties is a term that was first coined by the Scottish writer Henry Mackenzie, the author of The Man of Feeling in 1771. But by my estimation, the War of Duties had already existed for 100 years. I first find it in Madame de Lafayette's La Princesse de Clèves, in which she is torn between the memory of her husband and her lover, the Duc de Nemours. And it's a problem that was raised by Hobbes in Leviathan in the wake of the English Civil Wars about how do you restrain human passions. And it's the problem that occupied the moral sense philosophers and the philosophes. It's the problem that the Addison and Steele address with their calls to sociability. That is, to turning your energies, your bad emotions to your good emotions and your sociable nature and to society. So the central tension Mackenzie writes about in the War of Duties is one of the conflicting traditional duties to others, choosing between your duties to your father and your husband, your mother and your sister, and this new sentimental duty to oneself, to one's happiness. And Mackenzie complains that the novels aren't as really straightforward and didactic as he would like, that they are complicated, complex. The waters are muddied about what people should do. It's the debate that Kant and Schiller are part of in their discussions of duty. On the one hand, for Kant, it should always be a difficult duty. And Schiller, on the other hand, who asks, well, can't duty also follow one's inclination? And inclination is another really important word in these debates. And so sentimentalism turns out to be a very powerful aesthetic because of its ambiguities, because it is opportunistic. It allows you to have your cake and eat it too. You can make it seem that women can find love no matter their situation, but in the end, duty to society, duty to others must win. That is, Anna Karenina can leave home, but she can't go back. And so the first typology and what really kind of launched my project was Margaret Cohen's Typology of Sentimental Novels, in which what I think are often perceived as artistic failings are in fact conventions that serve to heighten the emotional tensions over the moral struggle between equally valid duties. And so the plot is stripped bare, the characters are stripped, you have a limited cast of characters, descriptions are limited, and everything moves with great pacing. And there are also all these moments that are denouements that create the tension. And as we've already seen in Pushkin and Katen, there are tableaus that embody virtue. So these struggles over virtue are in fact the point, the complexity, the plot of sentimental novels, and they are endlessly reinvented. And as I discovered, the actual word duty is what clues us into what is going on. So for example, Clarissa is introduced as a character, as a daughter defined by her filial duty. And that really is her role in the novel. So it's a very precise tool to follow. And this takes us to the Russian quandary in how to translate that word. So you'd be surprised to see in 18th century translations of Pamela that her duty to herself and her duty to her virtue, all duty in Pamela's life is translated as должность, because that is the one duty that there was for the Russian nobility in the 18th century. And Tatishev in the 1740s, in his lexicon to accompany his history, a lexicon to explain foreign words, defines duty. Under должность, he says, see duty, долг, and proceeds to give a complex definition of everything that we have thought of as possibly должность in terms of долг, in order to kind of change thinking. So what I discovered is that beginning with Karamzin and Zhukovsky, there is a kind of major shift as they explore the meanings of three words: должность, долг, and обязанность. Обязанность comes to us through Cicero's officium, which was translated in the 18th century as a должностях. And slowly but surely, writers developed systemic uses for these four terms. So I had this discussion with great excitement with Richard Wortman when his new book came out. And I discovered that duty was everywhere, but it wasn't a charismatic word. And so I managed to convince Richard very easily, I think, that duty does belong in this list of charismatic words, but it's so omnipresent that I think most of us take it for granted. And so this is the worst PowerPoint slide you'll ever see with way too much text, but I think you get the point very quickly. How Turgenev, in this important scene, the first verbal battle between Bazarov and Pavel Petrovich, uses these very high value words to stake out Pavel Petrovich's position on the value of the nobility. And Bazarov, of course, is also a noble. And so he even trots out the greater good, the bien public. And so I discovered that writers, the novelists we know and love, from the beginning of their career to the end of their career, are always developing this vocabulary. It's the vocabulary that they share with European writers and with their readers and with each other. It is the key, these are the key moments where the words get repeated or put together in interesting ways. So Turgenev would prefer to use dolg, as did Yevgeny Tur and Goncharov, and Dostoevsky, and Nadezhda Khvoshchinskaia and Tolstoy, on the other hand, moved very quickly to relying on the word обязанность. And so we can think of dolg as being kind of inner duties and обязанность as a real sense of duty to others and duty to society. But it's a system, and the two tend to be translated kind of interchangeably, but they really represent kind of different nuances of this system. So the importance of noble service culture, I think, has only recently come to be appreciated in literature. I realized that most of my women writers were from the nobility, as were the male writers. Their characters and their readers are mostly from the nobility. Russia had the largest nobility in Europe, 750,000 people. And it wasn't just that the Russians were following the European fashions, but these competing duties are a very important new context for noble service culture, because it allowed Russians to transform the servility of service that Trotsky complains about in Griboyedov's Gorya at Uma into independence. They're choosing between duties. They're engaged in a war of duties in which there isn't just one duty. And the new noble stage for these dilemmas are the estates. And that's only one of the reasons I'm so happy to have John Randolph as a discussant. And so the landowners are practicing these new independent duties, and the heroine, her duty often is to find the unheralded landowner and love him for it. So George Sand turned out to be a truly unique vehicle for Russians to think about these problems. And how important Sand was in Russia is in fact measurable. And so it's not only measurable quantitatively, but also qualitatively. So several quotations. Yevgeny Tur, who was known as the Russian George Sand. George Sand is not only a great writer, but also a thinker, not only a thinker, but also a political figure, a public intellectual. Dostoevsky, a scholarly study of how writers Schiller, George Sand influenced Russia and to what extent would be an extraordinary and serious undertaking. D.S. Mirsky, in his History of Russian Literature, coins the term sentimental realism to explain Gogol and George Sand were the father and mother of Russian realism. Sand's philanthropic sentimentality, a sympathetic attitude to human beings without distinction, became the formula of all the Russian novelists and was what Europe accepted as their message to mankind when they were first revealed to the West. So Sand was a node for the Russians in these very important discussions amongst themselves, with their readers, and with their European counterparts. And she reinvented, she was a common, formed a common language for people. And her novels bring duty to the fore. And I have yet to this aspect of Sand's work is raised by Margaret Cohen, but I haven't really found the scholarship on Sand that explains this. So she reinvented duty, especially duty in love, and created the rules. And as Margaret Cohen shows wonderfully, she broke the rules. And so Dostoevsky eulogizes her the sublime moral purity of her heroines, because they somehow stayed morally pure while really breaking the rules. And so what was so attractive to the Russians in Sand's work was that in a highly stratified noble service culture, the table of ranks, Sand was able to dissolve class and gender boundaries in new ways. So her novel Horace from 1842 evoked a very strong reaction from Russian writers. Horace is a provincial bourgeois, he's a student, and he becomes a writer. Sand modeled him on her lover, Alfred de Musset. Horace has an illegitimate child with a working class mistress, Marta. This was, these women were called grisettes. The narrator of Horace, who is from the nobility, he's a doctor, he has a grisette who tries to lecture Horace on feminism. So the class structures are completely fluid in this novel. And Herzen, in his notes, said, well, there's something Horace-ish about all of us, because the Russians really responded to Horace's glib egoism, his hypocrisy. He talks a good game about duty and love, and look what he did. Tolstoy said, oh, my brother said that his personality resembles mine, and he's right. And so the Russian Horaces, their transformation onto Russian soil, the Russian Horaces are no longer provincial bourgeois or students or writers. They are feckless, dangerous nobles who are unable to do their duty. They recognize it, but they cannot do it. And so Nadezhda Khvoshchinskaia began her career with the tale Anna Mikhailovna in 1850, a Clarissa-like tale of a woman who leaves home. And her last novel was titled Obligations, Обязанности. And so we sense her trajectory very quickly, just in the titles of the novels. So her novel, The Test from 1854, has a heroine, Varenka, who faces a war of duties. She's in love, but she also has obligations to her parents and to her family. And there's a twist that Khvoshchinskaia introduces. The parents disagree. Her father will allow her to marry for love, but her mother wants her to marry for money. And so the machinations of the mother and her brother, Varenka's uncle, Alexei Dmitrievich Shatrovsky, a Russian Horace, a phrasemonger who fails his ethical tests of small, not large deeds. Through their machinations, Varenka finally gives up and bows to family obligations and marries the unscrupulous neighboring wealthy landowner. Turgenev, in his first novel, Rudin, from 1856, modeled his hero on Bakunin to some extent, but also borrowed from Horace to create the superfluous nobleman as a phrasemonger who uses the high-value words of love and duty hypocritically. He courts Natalia. Natalia has a moment like George Sand's Indiana, where she drops everything for love, but she quickly recovers herself. And when the relationship is discovered, Rudin leaves, and he leaves behind two letters, one about love and the other about his debts to the neighboring landowners. And they grouse to each other. Oh, he considered it his duty to write this letter, and he presented himself to you out of a sense of duty also. And for these gentlemen, there is a duty in every step, and everything is duty and debts. And so this is a play on the Russian, it's the same word, dolg and dolgi. And Dostoevsky, for his comeback novel, his first novel after prison and exile for 10 years, wrote The Insulted and the Injured. It was the most popular novel in his lifetime. It went through 5 editions. And in this novel, we see Dostoevsky kind of coming up to speed. It's his education and duty. And he, in typical Dostoevsky fashion, he kind of overdoes it. He really gilds the lily in a very complicated novel that I think acquires more sense when we see it as 3 Gordian knots of filial duties, of conflicting duties. So Natalia Ifmeneva is Dostoevsky's first Sandian heroine. She has her conflicting duties to her father and to the 2 men she loves, the kind of Dostoevsky stand-in, the narrator, and Prince Alexei Balkovsky. Balkovsky has conflicting duties to his father and to the 2 women he loves, Natalia and the woman that his father chooses for him, a wealthy heiress. And then we come to the father, Prince Pyotr Balkovsky. And it turns out that his wife was engaged in a similar Gordian knot of filial duty. She betrays her father in order to run away with Prince Pyotr. And the novel also includes a confession scene where Prince Pyotr regales the narrator with his lack of morals, and he does it through the language of duty, which makes it shocking. He calls himself an authentic Russian soul. I, for instance, have long freed myself from all shackles and even obligations. I only recognize obligations when I see I have something to gain by them. Life is a commercial transaction. It's better not to pay one's neighbor, but to know how to force him to do things for nothing. I have no ideals, and I don't want them. And this is the first of Dostoevsky's truly evil characters. And Khvoshchinskaia was Dostoevsky's equal in creating some of these evil characters. So some additional conclusions by way of an ending. Russians took the war of duties into very new directions because they questioned whether duty was sufficient to rein in one's worst impulses, to rein in the authentic Russian soul. In Europe, duty was parodied to death by Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, etc. But in Russia, conflicting duties only died after the revolution. And so the last novel in which I find this fully developed kind of system from the 19th century is, strangely enough, in Zamyatin's science fiction novel, We. And so that's the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hilda, for this extremely thought-provoking presentation. John, on to you now.
All right, thank you very much, Ilya and Anne and Sarah and Alexandra and colleagues for allowing me to join this presentation today. Sorry, I had it up here, my comments, and I lost track of them for a second. So Hilda's presentation covers a great many themes and a century's worth of observations. Women's literature and its relationship to literary canons, the relative weight of literature in Russian and other languages in the Russian Empire, the definition of sentimentalism, its primacy over the century, its relationship to philosophical debates, and its relationship to noble service culture. And it's extremely wide-ranging. It has a number of amazing themes, and I really look forward to the conversation about them. I'm only supposed to take 5 minutes, so with your permission, I'm just going to dive into one of these themes, approximately, I guess. And that is the theme of duty and obligation and their cultural transformation in the 18th and 19th centuries. I very much appreciated Hilda's specification of sentimentalism not merely as a literature of feeling, but as a literature of a war of duties and desires, of the conflict of a subject or subjects who feel the pressure to restrain feelings in the name of a duty to serve some greater supra-subjective purpose, such as the notion, for example, of a common good, or a filial piety, or other possible things. And if I understand you right, Hilda, you're saying that the vast majority of non-Russian language fiction works sold in the empire were of this type, and that non-Russian language fiction was actually the lion's share of the market through mid-century. And it seems that then an extension from this is that to remain in contact with that reality, Russian writers had to at least have had some sentimental substrate to their novel, even if, as we could all probably think off the top of our heads, of famous examples where in Russian novels, sentimental literature is itself satirized, right, as somehow insufficient or not rising to the moment. Nonetheless, having this a continuing role of sentimental's wars of duties within the novel across the century, and indeed, I guess, the place of melodrama within the novel across the century. One question you raise is whether the imperial reading and writing public was in some senses primed for sentimental literature, for a literature focusing on the clash between duty and desire, because it developed among the society of Russia's nobility with what you call the nobility's service culture. So I want to just talk about that for just a second. And I think it's a really fascinating set of themes that opens up. And one theme as well that you have in your remarks is, in your paper, is how this transforms over the century. And I also want to talk about that a little bit. So is it related to noble service culture? From my perspective, I would say yes. And setting aside nobles for just a moment, I also wonder, though, if we couldn't go even broader than that. Nobles, of course, weren't the only social group in Russia defined by some combination of service obligations and related privileges. This is, a general, within history writing, just put on my historian's hat for a moment, within the imperial turn of the past couple of decades, as we come to see the degree to which Russia was an empire, one of its structuring moments was indeed this dialectic, combinations of service obligations and privileges. All social groups were defined by them. And so on one level, the tension between some larger suprapersonal duty and some personal particular aim is hardwired into the way that the Russian state built its authority across space. And in this sense, although sentimentalism is often thought of as a part of bourgeois, burgher, middle-class culture, as in classic theories of the rise of the novel, in some ways, your presentation suggests to me, it plays well, very well, as a poetics of empire.
Oh, yeah.
So as something that develops within that context quite fluidly. And then that's partly what I mean by going even broader than the nobility, although, of course, nobles have a role. So then what about noble culture specifically? and service culture in particular. When you talk about the vocabulary of devoir, of sort of central category of duty in the sentimental novel and how it enters Russian, you talk about dolg and обязанность and должность and terms like that. But I guess from the point of view specifically of service culture in the Russian Empire and from the 18th century perhaps and going forward and thinking about what kinds of transformations are involved to bring into imperial culture this sentimental rhetoric. I think another key term we might add as well is sluzhba. And sluzhba is interesting in the sense that over time, it certainly can acquire the kind of moral possibilities of a word like duty. I mean, duty is not merely always something that you're forced to do, but it's also something that you can see as an internal moral principle that you need to follow that's internal to your being, internal to the subject. But sluzhba can have that connotation, but I think perhaps most fundamentally coming out of Russia's early imperial experience, it is seen primarily, or it is often framed as a liability, that is, as a повинность. This is something, sluzhba is not necessarily a moral category you bear within yourselves, but it is something that you are liable to do. And so just real quickly, I had a couple, can people see these? I had a couple excerpts from the manifesto giving liberty to the nobility. And in its preface, it talks about how Pyotr, Emperor Pyotr, ordered the nobility here to enter into military and civil services, right? And so that's kind of the language of the service, right? And then when they're quote unquote emancipated, they are a nobleman is уволен из нашей службы, right? That's the terminology of the liberty given to the nobility, that it's a liberation from служба. But then further down, you can see the повинность connection. So it's always somewhat qualified. So for example, if a nobleman is afar, even out of service, if the emperor demands that the nobleman return, then here it says, то всякий в таком случае повинен, and so with all possible speed to return. So повинен here is the key term, right? I had the wrong thing selected here. Hold on. There we go. Sorry. Again, I guess the only thing I really wanted from here is to say that sluzhba is another category. And one thing that I think your presentation really develops is the question of how that part of noble service culture also transforms over time. This is actually a theme, in other words, from a повинность, a liability, to a sense of moral obligation. Now, Mark Ryaff, in his Origins of the Intelligentsia, this is a key theme of that book, right? That noble culture is part of the origins of the moral ethos of the intelligentsia because it has a notion of service that's built into it that then is transformed and becomes kind of the ideological or cultural stratum out of which the intelligentsia grows. But I think one interesting implication of your work, Hilde, along these lines is, what is the role of sentimentalism in this process? And is there a way in which the sentimental canon is actually a driver of it, as opposed to a particular soslovia, right? Is there a way, I mean, not to set aside the nobility as being important to this, but rather to say, again, in a world where maybe people are hardwired to accept this kind of poetics, is there a way in which sentimentalism plays an important role in actually making that cultural transformation occur? And maybe that might then bring us back to this whole question of canon building. What is the role of that canon, whether or not, depending on how we define its place, in driving this kind of civilizational change that you're talking about? And it's a canon with women at its center. So I'll stop there and apologize for accidentally showing my notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. John, Hilda, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just very quickly. So I have a whole chapter devoted to rethinking sentimentalism, and so Lynn Festa has a wonderful book on the sentiment and empire, and how sentiment is using Anderson and the idea of creating these transnational communities where we don't have those communities. So it's part of how I show that sentimentalism really has legs and is tremendously opportunistic. It creates communities. So there's a good tradition of reclaiming sentimentalism as a liberal, as a liberating philosophy. But Festa says, let's do a reality check here, because it's harnessed to taking all of the poor and the downtrodden and kind of, redundantly humanizing them and making you feel good about humanizing them. But in fact, it's also an empire building genre. So yes, I agree with you entirely. And that to me, when I think about how the kind of the field as a whole has really embraced thinking about empire, I keep thinking, but what about sentimentalism? So I address that in kind of rethinking sentimentalism. And of course, when I read, I'm always sensitive to the word sluzhba, sluzhit. And I guess you're right. It is one of these charismatic words in the kind of in the noble kind of vocabulary. And so I will. I think it's one way to think about when you. I mean, why is Bantush Kamensky the great biographer of the careers of the great servitors? Why is he the first to translate a novel by Sophie Caten? Right? Why does he go on and write his own novel? Right? Pavel Svinin, our diplomat, the Russian diplomat to Philadelphia, he also writes a sentimental novel, right? So these are high value, cultural, social value projects. And so this is another way to kind of reimagine these novels that we've just dismissed. And one of the things, the 18th century is it's not only the novelists, it's the philosophers and it's the pedagogues, and their treatises, they're all hybridizing the genres in different ways. And so, yes, I agree. This is sentimentalism goes as big as you can because it addresses such fundamental problems about human nature.
Great, thank you, Sasha. So Sasha will moderate the discussion, right? And whoever has questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Hilda, for the great talk. And I'll start by agreeing with what Anne Lansbury wrote in chat, that I think this is a very kind of thought-provoking talk and direction, which has the potential of transforming our field. And I very much appreciate the way that you map sentimental fiction writing onto the political history and the history of political ideas, both Russian and global. And I think this is really the direction that is very promising. And in line with that kind of mode of thinking, I'm going to ask a general question. And this is not maybe actually fair to a speaker who's obviously kind of doesn't have to respond to all the general queries, but I think that this is like something that is really something that would be nice to think about together. And I kind of, so mapping sentimentalism onto the idea, the history of duty and histories of understanding of duty is something that I find very much convincing. But the question here is where there is a point. There is an opposite aspect to it, right? There is kind of outside of the visions of empire and duty and service. So the general space of the empire and the modeling the subject. There is also the space for critique, right? Which Foucault defines as the kind of demand to be governed in a different way. And for Lotman, if we are speaking about general narrative of Russian literary history, for Lotman, this critique is the basis of literary development. So critique basically says it is all wrong, right? We are not living in a world where nobles are regulated by duty and literature kind of helps them do that. But we are living in a world where all wrong, where this whole order is completely wrong, right? And as we move towards realism, high realism, which is of course sentimental, as you've shown, we have that sense as well, right? It's not only about regulating, it's about showing that the very act of regulating is completely wrong. And this is an open-ended question, but I think in talking about a lot of things that you mentioned, it would be a great kind of other side to think about.
Thank you so much, Kirill. So John mentioned that the literature we know and love doesn't stint on its critique of sentimentalism. But that is part of the revitalization of sentiment in the 19th century. So Goncharov does it, but only to reuse, to revitalize the sentimental vocabulary. And so it seems, Tolstoy's Resurrection, which is also not part of the canon, is very heavy on обязанности, and it's the language that he had in order to critique how it's all wrong. And so it turns out to, as I said, it's a tremendously opportunistic vocabulary that can be used in so many different ways. And so it can be used on the one hand. So the general view that we have of sentimentalism as tears, etc., well, that's the critique that comes out of the French Revolution, but it's part of a war within sentimentalism. And so that war within sentimentalism continues in the 19th century. I just don't think you're going to be finding, in Tolstoy's work as much of a renegade as he was. And so, Rosamund Bartlett's history of biography of Tolstoy really shows that his ideas were tremendously powerful and dangerous to society, after his death. But nevertheless, there is, constantly this tension between, maintaining order and allowing for disorder because of the questions that, Hobbes raised in Leviathan, like what's the end of all of this? And we remember from that famous 5-word list in Hobbes, we remember nasty, brutish, and short, but the first word is really important: solitary. Right? Where is your community if you go down this road? And so I see the vocabulary of sentimentalism as being able to address all of these contradictions.
If I could just say one word, and I see there's a question in the comments as well having to do with Madame de Genlis. I mean, she's an interesting, or the reception of her works is interesting in this regard, I think, because the idealists in the 1830s relentlessly polemicized against Madame de Genlis, seeing her as representing formal moral principles that were merely obligations, but not animated by truth or authenticity or reality. They were a form of delusion in a way, from the point of view of like Stankiewicz and Bakunin and some of these folks when they're corresponding. So in the correspondence with the Bakunin sisters, and Bakunin sisters also adopt this rhetoric. So it's not only actually just Bakunin and Mikhail Bakunin himself, but what's interesting about that, that's from the point of view then of like, no, the real authenticity is to be achieved through paying attention to first principles derived from experience and sort of Fichtean philosophy. So anyway, the point being that they're not really escaping that dilemma so much as they're just like relentlessly critiquing Genlis for being formulaic and for being the wrong extreme.
Yes, I mean, Genlis was criticized in her lifetime, of course, But again, it's, as Pushkin, says about Clarissa, you read it with interest, but it's boring and it's long. And so everyone read Jean-Lee. You had to read Jean-Lee. That was the conversation. But the parody I love the most of Jean-Lee is Liskov, where he has an epigraph to a story where the image of Jean-Lee keeps coming back. It's very hard to get rid of her, he says. And so part of this is that she's still alive, because yes, in War and Peace, Ollie Ackroyd, they mock Madame de Genlis, but what is Kutuzov reading? Madame de la Valliere.
Hilda?
Yes.
No. Yes, thank you for a fascinating talk. I wanted to clarify one point that you made. Like you said, the war of duties. So could you maybe explain a little bit about this idea of duty to oneself and to one's happiness? Because I guess it's, well, we're taught that in like neoclassicism, right? It's the duty versus passion is the war, right? But here you're saying it's a war of duties. So could you just sort of give a little bit background for this idea of duty to oneself?
So the initial war of duties is one of what in the 18th century is characterized in the Encyclopédie and also by Mackenzie. It's a traditional war. So your duty to your country versus your duty to your family. It's really one of the driving motives for Cicero's instructions to his son on his duties, because duty gets muddied by what you owe your family versus what you owe the state. But then sentimentalism adds another duty to yourself, to your happiness. And so then, Mackenzie, for example, is complaining, we had those traditional duties where you have to make the hard choices, and now we've got a more pleasant duty. We shouldn't have that, right? And so, George Sand is wonderful. So Horace, the novel, has, instances. So the working girl Marta is rescued by Arsène. He's an artisan. He's a cobbler like his father, but he's also an artist. And Arsène learns in his journey. He does his duty. He provides for his sisters, but he also learns that he has a duty to himself and a duty to God. He has a duty to his talent. Right. So what you get is the multiplications of other duties at the same time as you're supposed to do your traditional duties. And so the fun, the interest of all these novels is seeing these collisions of duty. That's how they're organized.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk. And one thing that I really especially enjoyed first of all, I agree with the general accolades. I'm sympathetic, to this line of research, but I think it'll be really useful for all of us. One of the things that I enjoyed the most about your talk and your other research was pointing out that just because some writers that have later become canonical and contemporary reviewers argue that certain texts that we might categorize as sentimentalist might seem to us as difficult to relate to or boring, doesn't mean that they struck all readers from the period that way. I think that that's something that comes with studying the history of emotions in general, that people are sort of trained to think of feelings as universal feelings. So, obviously the way that there are ways in which we can relate to texts that are produced by different cultures, but it's really easy to forget that just because something might strike some readers as inauthentic or, might annoy certain sectors of the public doesn't mean that they weren't actually resonant in a significant way. And I think that that's a really, really, really important contribution to make. I just wanted to ask about And I agree with you about sentimentalism having legs. And I would also, I personally say that I think that it probably continues into the Soviet period. I mean, especially if you look at narratives surrounding World War II and that sort of thing. There's a lot of lines that you can connect to the narrative that you've given us and the narratives that we see in, you know, films like The Cranes Are Flying or Wings. But I wanted to ask you about some differentiations within sentimentalism to sort of take the conversation in a different direction. I know that you mentioned you had a chapter about Zhukovsky and then also some writers I'm not familiar with, but I'm excited to learn more about when you publish the book. Do you see any distinctions between poetry that sort of fits into a sentimentalist genre and prose? We've mostly talked about prose and novels in this discussion. And then my other question, it's a really important contribution to sort of recover the extent to which women writers and readers were a part of this conversation. But when we think about gender, it might also be useful to think about sort of analogs, potential analogs that are gendered in the opposite way. And here I'm thinking about military culture, which was of necessity primarily male. I mean, I guess there's exceptions like Durova, but you know, very gendered in a different way, but also still built around service and around duty. And you know, maybe this isn't something that obviously your book can't encompass everything as much as we'd like it to. But I wondered if you thought about that at all and about potentially the influence of experiences like the war against Napoleon, for example, which affected those serving in the military in a specific way, but also affected everybody in Russian society because it was a total war to a certain extent, and how those experiences and the necessity of sort of, you know, building a wartime spirit and that sort of thing might have influenced the development of sentimentalist culture. So you don't have to answer all of those. Those are just what I was wondering about, whatever you have time to think about. But thank you again for a great talk.
Thank you, Emily. I can say that every year I teach a capstone seminar in Russian to our students, and we read some of the Belkin tales. And I have students from ROTC, and I have no trouble explaining to them what we're dealing with. They totally get it. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's a language that speaks loud and clear across many situations. I can't answer the questions on poetry. That is really beyond my expertise, and I know that there are people who do that very well, so I will leave it to them.
Thank you.
I don't do poetry very well, but one thing I would say is just getting to this like multiple genre question. You know, one huge genre of the late 18th, early 19th century is soldiers' songs. Mm-hmm. And the soldiers' songs are almost invariably, you know, they have to do with conflicts like this, where it's like, you know, I don't want to be away from home, but now I have to go away from home, or I'm out here in the field, but I'm thinking, you know, my heart is at home. You know, anyway. So I think that's another one thing that I think is intriguing about your research, Hilde, in this sense, is that I think if we were to try to pursue it outside of what we might think of as artistic literature into popular culture in the 19th century, we would find similar war of duties playing quite well.
Yeah, it's such a ready, easily relatable vocabulary. It's everywhere. Hi, Donna.
Hi, Hilda. How wonderful to see you. And I think the last time I saw you was actually in Helsinki.
We have crossed paths at conferences.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm so impressed by this talk, and your work is so interesting. I want to make one point, which is that the new tools that we have now, you're using them so, the data gathering tools, you're using them so creatively, and it shows how ideas are infiltrate and change a culture. So it's extremely helpful. That's just a comment that it can be done with various things. But how do we get from Hobbes or Locke to the transformed Russian modern culture? So, and that's all those charts and so on, those kinds of calculations that you've done are helpful in watching that happen. So that was one thing I wanted to say. I wanted to say that that what you're talking about is how Russia absorbed Western individualism. Goes from a communalist culture where people don't think about themselves as individuals to a culture where you have to know why you're doing something. So a soldier didn't ask before why he needed to serve his country, but Pushkin asks that question. He doesn't. And I think that and in being absorbed into the Russian context, it becomes Russianized. And the great thinking that goes on is how does that happen? And one of the ways it happens, of course, is by the words that are chosen. And we have Richard Wortman's great work on this subject, which we've all been inspired by, and which you're using his technique, as it were. And when you're talking about individualism, you're talking about people's feelings and impulses. And that's where sentimentalism comes in. That it's, you don't do it because it's rational, you do it because it feels good. And the greatness of, it seems to me, of the the Russian experiment in this in the 19th century is trying to combine the moral and the impulsive, shall we say. So here's a question for you, Hilda. I just taught Kapitanskia Dochka to a group of freshmen. I love that work so much because it does ask the question of why should we be honorable? Why do we care? Why is dolg so important? And so here's my question. Why is it called Kapitanskia Dochka? Why is it named after the female character?
I love it.
And why those two words?
Yes, I love that. So that is a question I love to ask. Why isn't it Maria Ivanovna? Why isn't it Maria? Or as all commentators call her Masha. And so in the Pushkin article I published in 2015, I go into this a little bit. It's Kapitanskaya Dochka because it's who her father is. It's her rank. When she's recognized by Catherine, that's what's recognized. And so that is the essence of what Pushkin, in his usual concise, incisive way, that is his point. She is the captain's daughter, and that is who she is. And she's not Masha actually in the novel. She's always Maria Ivanovna. There are only 3 times that she's called Masha. And so.
But Hilda, okay, I'll go there with you. But why is it Dochka?
Oh, okay.
That's really important because Kapitan is relegated to the adjectival.
Yes, that's a great question. So that she's only the diminutive, and she's only Masha several times in the narrative. So the word searches tell you that, and so she's a Dochka when Grinyov's mother is talking about marriage.
Yeah, and she refuses to marry Grinyov.
Yeah,
without the permission of her parents. So again, where does the moral come from? Anyway, I'll stop. I know there's lots of other people who want to speak too, but you and I have to talk, Hilda.
Yeah, so she makes her choice. She makes the right choice because she doesn't have the permission of his father.
Yeah,
he doesn't have his father's permission, and so she defers. As she should.
Yeah, as she should. She's the noble one, not Grinyov makes a misstep there. That's why it's named after her.
So Grinev is acting out. So those of us who've had a look at Pushkin's History of Pugachev, he faults the nobility for not sufficiently engaging with the populace, and so Grinev kind of is his stand-in for who befriends Pugachev, unknowingly at the beginning of the novel, and so has a relationship there which Pushkin thought was probably wise for the nobility.
I just wanted to respond to Hilda's remark. I think the work is very impressive, and it raises a number of questions. And as for charismatic words, I do believe I invented the term, but I don't have a monopoly on it. So I'm quite willing if somebody else uses it. But in the book, I indicated that at the very beginning, that I'm dealing with words that emerge from power, either the state or ideologies that bear the promise of power, and that therefore it has that connection, while things like obligation and duty, as Hilda shows very well, come out of the intellectual parlance and literary parlance, and they do have an emotional weight, and so I think you're right to do that. So I'm going to think about it. I mean, about how different words and different historical expressions have a common emotional impulse, but obviously also the charismatic words I use are used by specifically defined groups that and that attach to words an emotional, personal, and philosophical value that lasts as long as the group and develops its own traditions. And mainly, it's I would use it as Weber did in a political context, not a literary context.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question, a comment from Shama Shahadat. Thanks for the great talk and comments. Would you say that the paradigm of female moral duty as staying pure and preserving your virginity in Russia changes from the 18th to the 19th century? Lisa does not think about her virginity when she gives into Eros, but saying pure is important in the 19th century for Tatiana, who does not leave her husband for Anna, who is punished for leaving her family. In Western European sentimental literature in the 18th century, on the other hand, the main action of women in novels is to flee from rakes in order to preserve their virginity.
Oh, thank you, Shama. This is a great question. It goes to one of these topics that is so central to our thinking about these novels, and so we have. I'm so glad that you kind of close with Richardson and the fleeing from the rake to preserve virginity, but the real question for Richardson, and I hunted and hunted and hunted, and I found Thomas Kamer on the reception of Richardson. And so this takes us back to a question that Emily Wang raised about how readers then perceive novels that we today look at rather differently. And so for Richardson and for his readers, his novel was a political novel in the sense that he had a horse in the race. There was a law before Parliament that he claimed he helped pass through the writing of this novel, which was to prevent women from eloping against their parents' will, and then having to have some of their, the family inheritance settled on them after the fact. And so the law basically stipulated that if you eloped, nothing could follow you. And it was to cut down on elopements. So her filial duty is to stay in her father's house and to marry the man her father wants her to marry. And all the trials and tribulations are the sufferings she must endure for having violated her father's, her duty to her father. And so Clarissa remains this touchstone, and through it's hard to, you know, Pushkin is right. He has to deal with it. It's a touchstone through its French translation. And so what Prévost did, he cut it substantially, and it's over 1,000 pages. He cut it substantially, and he narrativized, you know, many of the letters, and it was seen as too cruel for readers. And and Richardson, of course, you know, constantly was editing the novel. He was getting feedback from his readers, and they wanted a little less duty to God, so he obliged them, and, you know, a little more this and a little bit of that. The last redaction of that novel is from 1811, and then in 1846, 47, 48 in Russia, Jules Janin did another French adaptation, and Druzhinin translated it, and Clarissa is mentioned there. And it's mentioned in Khvoshchinskaia's first novel. And by my calculation, it's only Yelena in On the Eve who is able to leave home and compromise herself and stay alive to tell the tale. So it's Turgenev breaks the spell, but it's, you know, he's using that story. So the purity is the byproduct, I think, of the duty. And Yelena also talks about her duty in a very Sandian way, about with her Bulgarian lover. You know, I don't see a duty to my parents. You know, she doesn't say it. Tour says it for her in Tour's review, where she spars with a Russian woman. So with I think Natalia Grot, about where Yelena should see her duty. Her parents are hypocrites, and so Yelena is frank. I only see my duty to the man I love, and that's a move straight out of Indiana by Sand.
So we have a question from Alexei Dorfin. Thank you so much, Hilda. Very inspiring talk. Could you say some more on the reasons and explanations for why Sand was much more popular in German countries and in Russia, according to your chart? Thank you.
Well, I tried to explain how Sand was an important phenomenon in Russia that we have always known, but it's hard to say exactly how important, but the data now kind of shows it. The first life and work study comes out of Russia. It's Stasov's niece, who writes under the pen name Karenin, Varvara Stasova, and it's very comprehensive, and it's 4 volumes, and you know, for her she was also a woman writer, and it's obvious, and so I gave you some sense through the quotations, but it seems, it seems to me that, so when we look at the German market, so the German market is very interesting because a lot of French novels are republished in French. And so my guess is, I don't know, the data is there. Kirsten Wiedemann has done that scholarship. And the database Women Writers is very good on Sand because it started, the director is a Sand scholar, and it started with a lot of that data. I've put in all the Russian data. So the German market is publishing in German and in French. So Caten's novel Elisabeth is published in French as a primer for women learning, for people learning French. And so that's one of the functions of French literature in the German market. So I can't speculate on why sand was so important in Germany. But I think as some of the charts I have show, we should always remember who Russia's big neighbor is. And so that lots of literary influencers are coming in through Germany as well as through France.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilda. This was really super interesting and thought-provoking. I wanted to go back to a point that you made earlier in the talk, which was the idea that it would be good, it would be a relief even for someone like me who's kind of been thinking about this question for a while and struggling with it, to sort of stop thinking about female writers of the 19th century as a separate category, right? That just doesn't seem helpful in any way, and to sort of and I guess I'm kind of curious about what that would look like. What would our vision of the literary field for the 19th century be like if we successfully did that? And what, and as far as the canon is concerned, I'm sort of increasingly convinced that we just don't need it. Right, and it's just not a useful category, except of course as an object of historical investigation itself. So how do we, so kind of how do we use that that corpus, that we still for now designate the corpus of female writing, in order to create a situation in which we're not stuck either with this binary or with the idea of the canonical versus the non-canonical. I'm thinking of the British example, of course, as one that seems worth emulating, right? Where we just don't think of at least I don't think of authors like George Eliot and the Brontes as somehow in a category of their own vis-a-vis Dickens and Trollope, and right, they just form one corpus. Sorry, so that was too long, but
yeah. So these really are the questions that I've wondered about. And so Ilya, I read your article about Lotman and Moretti, and thinking about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and how do you kind of deal with the kind of the influx of European literature, and does Russian literature have anything of its own? And so I feel that this kind of big data approach through the markets and through very specific following of these particular words really shows us that the Russians are engaging in a very it's just only good news for thinking about 19th century Russian literature. So the problems that we've seen before, that Russia is somehow behind, or they're feeling that they're behind, that's really nonsense. In fact, I characterize Russians as these kind of vacuum cleaners for all of European literature. That I used to think that, well, Dostoevsky and Pushkin with his library and Tolstoy, they were exceptions. Well, they weren't. It's just, so to me, there's just, so much that is good from just kind of throwing open the windows on all of this and just kind of looking at everything. So I have talked with Helena in the other 19V about what is necessary. I've talked with Anna about what is necessary, and it's very clear if we look at the historiography of women writers in England, for example. So or we look at historiography in Russia, what you need is a champion. You need someone who explains the writer. You need a biography, you need translations. Last weekend, some of you may have read with as much interest as I did in the New York Times Magazine how we can thank our love for Vincent van Gogh to his sister-in-law, who just made sure that she got the word out, and she put the letters together with the paintings. She worked the art scene. So Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, well, bless their younger wives, who actually wrote and met with each other to discuss their publication strategies, how to reach writers. Turgenev, who said, well, you know, if only if only Gogol had had a wife. And there is Khvoshchinskaia, who is, you know, one of 3 writing sisters, the Russian Bronte sisters. So, you know, that biography has to be written in order to kind of get her into the mainstream discussion. The descriptions of the different novels need to be put up. I have all the texts scanned and searchable for anyone who wants, you know, Khvoshchinskaia's text. We have the letters. We have them transcribed from the archives, over, you know, about 500 letters, a selection of which was published. I'm happy to share all of that. And I want conferences. I'm hoping for conferences next year. I've talked with Sarah about that. And Anna, I'm going to talk with you about that to kind of capitalize on this. So if we look at, for example, Jane Austen, who is the greatest phenomenon now, well, that didn't happen by itself. I mean, she didn't write enough. That's what we now see, thanks to the data. You have to have a lot of presence to kind of, it was thanks to a relative who wrote a biography of her that got the word out. And the Brontes, well, we have to thank Elizabeth Gaskell's biography, which was written at the family's request in order to protect the family's reputation. So then we have Nadezhda Khvoshchinskaia, and she's, as I say in my introduction to Sofia Khvoshchinskaia's City Folk and Country Folk, you know, they're really partly to blame for the situation, because Khvoshchinskaia was begged by Druzhina and her editor at Ichezhisia Zapisky, please use your own name. Like, they understood what worked. What are the, you know, Dostoevsky's most popular work was his prison memoir, right? And what is Tolstoy's forced work? It's you know, it's a type of autobiography that it was seen as an autobiography that kind of tells you what people are looking for, what they need in order to kind of put a person with the work. And so this is what we need. It seems to me, to kind of change that picture. We need to know more.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I just, one other thing that I wanted to suggest was that it would really be great to have conferences and panels that are just mixed, right? Unapologetically mixed, right? Not a panel on women's writing, but a panel on the topic in which women's writing are included.
Yes, and so, you know, for my next book, you know, that's why I decided to have chapters that are men and women. You know, I looked at the canon, I looked at the situation, and I said, well, I want to be read, and I want to be read broadly. So this is what I'm going to have to do. And I know it makes sense, but it's a lot of work. So I set about doing it. So I'm going to continue integrating Khvoshchinskaia, because she really is just calling for it. So my next project is on corruption in literature, on civil society, and, you know, with Herzen kind of as my big name, but Khvoshchinskaia, Saltykov-Shchedrin, the others. And the idea is to do exactly as you say, just kind of, Khvoshchinskaia was very, very concerned with the Russian state and the importance of, you know, the nobles on the ground doing the work with the estates and with the serfs and taking care of the serfs. So we don't think of women writers aside from their women topics. And so this kind of takes aim at that question. So then the other question you have is, what do we do with the canon? Well, I think the canon is a fascinating question in Russian. Why is it so important? And what is its history? And we can look at Eugene Onegin and his articles on Russian literature that become a collection, Le Roman Russe, in the 1860s, that's translated into English and just kind of popularizes Russian literature in a new and important way, and kind of lays the groundwork. And so it's very interesting to me. You know, he makes his choices. D.S. Mirsky does something a little bit different. And so I have 3 articles on biobibliographic compilations, you know, going back to Boccaccio, looking at how women, you know, what genres do these collections on women come out of, and the separating of them. So I think the historiography of the canon is fascinating, but it's very tiring. You know, I agree. In English literature, you don't have to genuflect before Shakespeare before moving on to whatever women writer you want to talk about. And so there is an impulse here. So, you know, I'm on a Zoom group, and some of my great friends from the Zoom group are here. We read every day. It's an amazing, you know, New York, Columbia Slavists. And, you know, I had a question about how well do women writers hold up? How well do they hold up? And I was like, oh, not that question again. But then I realized, you know, even most of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky doesn't, quote, hold up, you know, if you want to take that approach. So there are other questions, right? There are other questions.
Thank you. This was a fabulous talk. It was so interesting. This is more a comment to add on what Hilda just said, I guess, about integrating women writers than, and I think this is a problem. I mean, I found them not because I was looking for women writers and I never thought this was an interest, but if you just start reading thick journals and reviews, often the work something's being compared to turns out to be by a woman, or it's 3 contemporary novels and 2 of them are by women. And so you realize that that's how they existed originally. I think the larger problem that you were getting at, Ilya, is the structural one, right? About how to fit them in and like how to kind of get to the point where the conversation is broader. And it made me think of Hilda's slide with Greta's statistics. When we have all these single author articles, it will get published if it's on Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. It's a little harder to make a case that everyone wants to read about Smirnova. And you know, the editors of a journal are probably right in terms of what's going to get readership. And so that is problematic and is part of why we need to genuflect at this, you know, shrine of Shakespeare before we talk about a lesser known author. And I don't think it's just true to women. And there's actually a way in which, if your article is about female writers, that almost gives it interest more than an obscure male author. So it can, I think, they'll perpetuate the, I'm writing about women, so we should care. Oh, it's like, it's got a weird thing. So I know in my own work, if you go thematically, because I work on the family, they're there because they're writing about the family and it's just very naturally integrated. But the thing, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've been writing a chapter on the novel for a volume, and in the workshopping of it, I had very deliberately made sure there were female authors in every section, but I also added a section at the end just to acknowledge that they were a really important part of the literary canon, because the previous, you know, Cambridge history specifically says women weren't writing novels. And so I wanted to like, it's either the classic Russian novel or history of the Russia, I can't remember which one, but there's a line. And so, but what I found was in the response, people are like, maybe we don't need that section, you should integrate them. But when they were integrated, nobody notices it because it's one example. And so I kind of feel like this is like a movement stage where the first step is we have to very explicitly acknowledge the presence and like state that. And then in 15 years, hopefully we can just have them integrated and everyone will be like, oh yes, of course, Khvoshchinskaia, or I don't know whether we should be calling her Christovsky pseudonym as she went by. That's an open question. I mean, if we call George Sand and, you know, George Eliot, I'm still calling her Christovsky pseudonym at the moment. But anyway, so this isn't exactly a question. It's just a saying, yes, this is something I think about all the time. And I think Hilda's work is so essential because she's laying so much of this groundwork for us. So deep gratitude. And the fact that she shares her PDFs has been a blessing to many of us.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, another fabulous resource for us is whatever research tools would make working in the journals easier. Right, because that is such a clear, you know, map of what it is that people were reading. And so the charts that I have are only as good as the data that I can get relatively easily. So I don't have, I mean, the journal data I have is thanks to the work that's being done through 1825, right, in that Pasobia. So I think that there are lots of ways to think about. I like your suggestions, Anna, about acknowledging what it is that we're doing as a strategy. So I definitely also see that we have to, we have to have that male author there to kind of tie in with the female author. I deliberately did not put women in my title. Noble Sentiments and the Rise of Russian Novels. And it was a real struggle in all the, in the editing for this novel to finally bring what I was so consciously suppressing to the front. And I found a way to do it because it has to be. And so as you see in this talk, I come right out and say, I work on women writers, and it is, but that has been completely suppressed underneath everything. But I realized that has to be front and center.
When is the book coming out?
Oh, I'm on the last polish of the last two chapters, and then it will go back to Toronto. And Toronto has a wonderful literary history series, book culture series, and so they were the one publisher that really was unafraid of the charts.
Great. Well, in that case, yeah, I just want to express the public sentiment of gratitude to Hilda for all your work and for this presentation, and to John for the great discussion, and everyone else. Thank you. Good seeing you, and see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully.